You think that fence means something to me?
My wife planted that vine. She planted it before she died. So you're going to stop touching it.
Back up.
Dad.
I have an attorney, Darnell, and a councilman who owes me a very large favor.
Your son entered my property and put his hands on me. I have witnesses. You should talk to your attorney.
And he could have ended it in 3 seconds. He knew exactly how. He'd done it in worse places than a neighborhood lawn, against worse people than a 22-year-old who had never once been told no by someone who meant it. But Darnell Osei stood at the edge of Cedar Lane on a Monday afternoon and did not move, because his daughter was watching, and whatever he did in the next 60 seconds was going to teach her something. One way or the other, and that was the moment everything came down to. But to understand it, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the Tuesday morning the file arrived. Back to the house on the street that didn't ask questions. Because that was where it started. Before the gloves hit the grass, and before the trucks pulled up, before any of it had a name. Cedar Lane was the kind of street that didn't ask questions. That was the thing Darnell liked most about it, and the houses sat back from the road at a respectful distance. The lawns were kept but not obsessive. People waved from their driveways and kept moving. Nobody knocked on your door to find out why your lights were on at 2 in the morning, and nobody asked what you did before you moved here. That was fine. That was exactly fine. Darnell ran the same route every morning at 5, left on Cedar, right on Birch, and down past the elementary school, past the gas station that had been closed for 8 months, but Tit's sign lit up every night like it was expecting customers, and around the park, back up Birch, left on Cedar, home 40 minutes every day. He had run it through 3 winters and 2 bad storms, and one morning when his left knee told him in clear terms to stop. He didn't stop. He slowed down, and he finished the route and came home and iced the knee and was back out the next morning. He didn't run because he loved it. He ran because stopping was worse. The neighborhood looked different at 5 in the morning, and quieter. More honest. The houses were just houses. The cars in the driveways were just cars. Nobody was performing anything for anybody yet. And the street existed without needing an audience. And Darnell understood that feeling in a way he couldn't have explained to someone who didn't already know it. He noticed the house every morning. The empty one, 2 doors down on the left. And it had been sitting vacant since February, when the Hendersons packed everything into a moving truck and relocated to be closer to their daughter in Phoenix. And the for sale sign had been up since March. Someone had taken it down last week. He slowed to a walk when he passed it. The front walk needed sweeping. The mailbox had a scratch along the side nobody had fixed, and the porch light was off, but the sensor on the garage was still blinking the way it did when the battery was getting low. He stood there maybe 10 seconds. Then he kept going. The inside of Darnell's house looked like a man lived there alone and had strong opinions about where things belonged. And the kitchen was clean, the kind of clean that happened when you cooked simply and cleaned up immediately and didn't let dishes sit because sitting dishes made him feel like something was unfinished. And the living room had a couch and 2 chairs and exactly as many books as fit on the shelves without stacking. And the shelves were his, but the shelves themselves the wood, and the brackets, and the careful finish those had been there, since Claire picked them out 3 years before she got sick, and he hadn't changed them. The home office was at the back of the house. 1 window that looked out on the garden, a desk that had seen better days, a chair that had not, a laptop that was 4 years old and still fast enough for everything he needed, and a filing cabinet with 2 drawers, the top one full of ordinary documents, the bottom one locked. The key to the bottom drawer lived on a small hook behind the desk, at exactly the height where it was easy to reach if you knew it was there and completely invisible if you didn't. And he had taken the key off the hook exactly twice in the past 3 years, both times to put something in, never to take something out. The work had started 6 weeks earlier, and he picked up contracts through a secure federal channel and reviewed the file, and completed the assessment, and submitted the finding, and clean, contained. Nobody visited the office, nobody needed to. The work moved through channels that didn't require a face. He was good at it, partly because he had spent 16 years developing a specific kind of attention, and the kind that noticed the thing slightly to the left of the thing everyone else was looking at. The small inconsistency. The record that should be there and wasn't. The date that was 2 days off in a way that couldn't have been a typo. The new file came in on a Tuesday, and reference number BF 922. An interstate freight accident. 14 months ago, a driver named Carl Owens, 51 years old, had been hauling a full load down a federal route when his brakes failed at 62 miles per hour, and he survived. The truck did not. Carl Owens was now in a modified wheelchair in a rented apartment in the same town where he'd lived for 22 years, unable to return to the only job he'd held for 16 of them. The brake maintenance records were gone, not misfiled, and not missing from the digital system due to a software error. Gone. Someone had gone through the physical logs and removed 4 months of entries, and whoever had done it had been careful enough that the removal wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it, and Darnell was looking for it. The name of the company holding the contract bid wasn't accessible at his clearance level yet. Standard procedure. He'd have it once the secondary verification processed. He didn't need it yet. He had enough in the file to begin, and he closed the laptop at 11:15 and went to bed. He was asleep by 11:17, and he was back at his desk by 5:50 the next morning, and post-run, and showered, and coffee going, and the email notification was already there, and secondary verification complete. File BF 922 company identification unlocked. He clicked it. He read the name, Bellamy Freight, LLC. He sat very still, not because the name surprised him. He didn't know that name yet, had no reason to, but the part of his brain that had spent 16 years making connections faster than he could consciously track them was already 3 steps ahead. He stood up from the desk, walked to the kitchen window, looked out at the backyard, and then he walked to the front of the house and looked out the window next to the door. The moving trucks were still there, 2 of them, parked in front of the empty house, 2 doors down, engine off, back doors open, and a crew was working steadily, carrying boxes and furniture up the front walk, with the unhurried efficiency of people who did this every day. On the side of both trucks, in clean white letters against a green background, Bellamy Freight, and Darnell stood at the window for a long moment. Then he poured his coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, drank it slowly. He had time. The file wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't going anywhere. He would handle this the way he handled everything, carefully, quietly, and without anyone needing to know what was happening inside his head until he decided it was time. He was good at that. Zoe came home on a Thursday. She drove herself, which she always did now, and 4 hours from school. She pulled into the driveway in the same beat-up blue sedan she'd had since freshman year and sat in it for a minute before getting out, the way she always did. Like she was giving herself a moment to shift modes, and Darnell was on the porch when she came up the walk. She had Claire's eyes. That had always been true, and it still hit him the same way every time, which he suspected was never going to change. And hey, Dad, hey, she hugged him. He hugged her back. They held it a beat longer than they usually did, which happened sometimes after weeks apart. She was 20 years old, and she'd been back twice since Christmas. Once in February, once in April. And each time, things between them were good in the way that things between people who loved each other but didn't quite know how to talk to each other could be good. Warm, easy on the surface, and something underneath that neither of them reached for. She went in and he carried her bags. He had made dinner. Nothing complicated. And the chicken dish he'd been making since she was 12, the one she'd eaten 3 plates of back then, and still claimed was better than anything the school cafeteria produced, which was not a high bar, but he took it. And they ate at the kitchen table, and she told him about the end of her semester, her roommate's situation for next year, and a professor who had given her a B- on a paper she'd worked hard on. Darnell listened and asked the right questions and refilled her water glass and thought about how she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. She was carrying something, and he recognized it, 'cause he carried things the same way, quietly, away from the surface, where other people couldn't see it unless they already knew what to look for. He almost asked, and he didn't. Conrad Bellamy introduced himself to the neighborhood the following Sunday. That was the only word for it, introduced. Like the neighborhood was a room he had walked into and needed to work. Darnell watched from his porch, and Conrad moved down the street with the ease of someone who had never once in his adult life been in a social situation he wasn't controlling. Mid-50s, well-dressed without being showy about it, and thick in the shoulders in the way men get when they were athletic young and haven't entirely lost it. And he laughed loud and often, and he remembered names from one conversation to the next which people responded to. He came to Darnell's porch eventually, held out a hand over the fence. Conrad Bellamy, just moved in 2 doors down. Darnell Osei. He shook the hand, firm grip and direct eye contact. The practiced ease of a man who understood that first impressions were infrastructure. Good neighborhood, Conrad said. Quiet, that's what we were looking for. A pause. And my son's staying with us for the summer. Training for what? Fighting. Something moved across Conrad's face, not quite pride, more like ownership. Kid's got a real shot. Amateur MMA, won 12 of his last 14. We're looking at going professional by fall, and good luck to him. He won't need luck. Said simply, as a statement. He's got the work ethic. Everything else follows. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, and the neighborhood. The coffee place on 5th. Whether the school 2 blocks over was as good as people said. Then Conrad moved on to Gloria Marsh's porch next door. Darnell watched him go, then went inside. He did not think about the company name on the trucks, and he did not let himself. Not yet. There would be a time for that calculation, and it wasn't now, standing on his own porch in the Sunday morning sun. Ethan Bellamy showed up later that afternoon, and different energy entirely. Where his father moved through space like someone who owned it and was generous of letting you borrow it, Ethan moved through space like someone deciding whether you were worth his time. He was 22. Big. Not oversized and functional big, and the kind of build that comes from years of training a specific thing, rather than general effort. Broad through the shoulders, controlled through the hips. The kind of body awareness that showed in how he walked, and he pulled into the driveway in a black pickup, got out. Looked up and down the street with eyes that were sorting and filing everything they landed on. Assessing the terrain before he'd unpacked a single box. Darnell was in the backyard by then, working on the garden, and he'd seen Ethan from the side window on his way through the house. He went back to the garden. He pulled 3 weeks of weeds from around the tomato plants and turned the soil at the edge of the bed near the fence. And Claire had started that garden 8 years ago with a bag of seeds from the hardware store and genuinely zero prior experience. She had killed the first round of everything. The second round she kept alive. And by year 3, she was growing more tomatoes than 2 people could reasonably eat and giving bags of them to Gloria Marsh every August. Zoe kept it going the first summer after. The second summer she was at school. Darnell kept it going, and not because he particularly loved gardening, and because it was something to do with his hands on the evenings when staying still felt worse than moving. The first real crossing happened on a Tuesday. Zoe was in the driveway, and she'd borrowed a small speaker from a friend and had it going while she worked, sitting cross-legged on the concrete with her laptop, and her notes spread around her, and she was taking an online course over the summer, something for her major, and she studied outside when the weather allowed, and the music was not loud. Darnell could hear it from the kitchen with the window open, and it was a background presence, nothing more. He registered it and kept doing the dishes. He heard Ethan before he saw him, the tone first, then the words, and he came out of the kitchen and through the side door before he'd consciously decided to. Ethan was standing at the edge of the driveway. Zoe had stood up from her laptop, and she was a step back from where she'd been sitting, which told Darnell everything he needed to know about how this had started. And need you to take that inside, Ethan was saying. I'm training. I can hear it through the wall. You're 2 houses down, Zoe said. Sound carries. It really doesn't. I didn't ask what you thought about the volume, and Darnell came down the 2 porch steps and stopped at the edge of the concrete. Ethan looked at him. Darnell looked back. She playing it too loud for you? Darnell said. Ethan considered the question the way men do when they find it beneath them, and I was talking to her. Now you're talking to me. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. He looked Darnell up and down, running a quick calculation, already confident he knew the answer. An ordinary man in his mid-40s, quiet and standing in his own driveway in a pair of gardening gloves. Not a threat. And all I'm asking, and, Ethan said, and using his reasonable voice, and is basic consideration for your neighbors, and nothing complicated. She's in our driveway, Darnell said, playing music at a level I can barely hear from inside my own kitchen, and that's not inconsiderate. That's Tuesday afternoon. Ethan's jaw moved slightly. She your daughter? Yes. Ethan turned back to Zoe, like Darnell had answered a question rather than closed one, and he reached past her quick, casual, like it was nothing, and picked up the phone she'd set on top of the speaker, and threw it. Not hard, not violent, just dismissive. The way you move something out of your way. And the phone skipped twice on the concrete driveway, slid into the grass, landed face down, and dead silence. Zoe didn't move. Smart. She'd already read that movement as something she didn't want to escalate with her body. Darnell looked at where the phone had landed, looked back at Ethan. Ethan was reading him, looking for the anger, for the shift, and for the thing that would tell him he'd landed the provocation correctly. Darnell's expression didn't change, not because he wasn't feeling something. He was. Several things, simultaneously, in a specific order he'd learned to process without letting them reach the surface. And he walked to the grass, picked up the phone, checked the screen. Cracked corner but still working. He handed it back to Zoe. Then he turned to Ethan. "Pick up a phone that doesn't belong to you again," he said, "and we're going to have a different kind of conversation." Pause, and apologized to her. Ethan stared at him, looking for the seam. "Not finding it. We're done here," Ethan said finally, and walked back to his house. Zoe watched him go, and then looked at her father. "You okay?" Darnell asked. "I'm fine." She looked at the phone. "Phone's fine too. Good." He went back inside. He went back to the dishes. His hands were completely still. That night, Darnell sat at his desk. The house was quiet, and Zoe had gone to bed around 10:30. The street outside had been silent since 11, and he had the desk lamp on and the laptop open, and the file BF 922 pulled up on the secure server, and he had been staring at page 47 of the maintenance audit for going on 30 minutes without reading a word of it. And he was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the way Ethan had looked at him, not the hostility he'd seen that coming before Ethan even opened his mouth. He'd placed it within the first 10 seconds of watching the kid get out of that truck. He knew that look, and he'd seen it on people ranging from 19 to 50, and what it always meant was the same thing underneath, regardless of what it was wearing on the surface. And I need to know where I stand, and I need to establish it fast. Because if I'm not at the top, something is wrong. That was a learned thing, deeply learned. You didn't come out of the womb needing to win every room that got built into you, and brick by brick, year by year, by someone who believed producing it in you was a form of love. Darnell had spent 12 minutes with Conrad Bellamy on a Sunday morning, and he'd learned what he needed to. He closed the file, opened his email, typed 3 lines to his contact at the department, flagging a potential conflict that would need review before he submitted anything. Then he stopped, deleted the 3 lines, closed the email, sat back, and he didn't have a conflict yet. He had a neighbor whose company was under review. Those were different things. He'd done this job for 4 years and never once let the circumstances of his personal life touch the outcome of a file. And that wasn't going to change because someone with Bellamy freight on their trucks decided to move 2 doors down. He would be careful. He would keep the distance. That was what he was good at. And the days that followed had a surface of normalcy that Darnell worked to maintain, and Ethan worked, in small ways, to disrupt. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to directly. The truck parked slightly past the property line one morning, and a light left on at the back of the Bellamy property, aimed directly at the window of Darnell's home office, that came on every night at 10 and went off at 1, and loud conversation in the Bellamy driveway about fights and opponents, and who hit harder that moved just close enough to the fence line to be present without being something you could address. Small things, each one small enough to ignore, all of them together not small at all, and Darnell said nothing. He adjusted the curtain in his office. He started his run 20 minutes earlier. He noted each thing the way he noted everything cataloged, stored, not reacted to, and Zoe noticed some of it. He could tell by the way she sometimes paused near the window when the noise from next door picked up. But she didn't ask him about it, and he didn't offer, which was its own kind of conversation. A language they'd both gotten fluent in over 3 years, and built out of things left unsaid. He thought about that sometimes, and he thought about it more now, with Zoe home for the summer, and eating dinner across from him every night, and studying in the driveway on Tuesday afternoons, and leaving her shoes by the door in a way that had always slightly annoyed Claire, and now somehow made the hallway feel more like a home, and he wanted to say something. He didn't know what. Gloria Marsh brought over tomatoes on a Friday afternoon, and she knocked, and which she always did, and waited, and which she always did. And then when Darnell opened the door, she held up the bag with the same expression she used for everything, and mild, direct, requiring nothing from you in return. "From my garden," she said. "I've got more than I can use. Come in." She came in and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and talked for 20 minutes about Cedar Lane the way she always did, and evenly, without malice, with the calm of someone who had watched this street from the same house for 2 decades and knew exactly what it was. She mentioned the Bellamys. "The father seems to know a lot of people," she said. "Talks like a man who's used to being listened to, and he runs a business," Darnell said. She considered her water glass. "The son's different, yes. Had some words with the boy down the street last week, and the one who's home from college." She set the glass down. "Didn't go anywhere, but I noticed." Darnell nodded. Gloria looked at him with the look she used when she was deciding whether to say the next thing. "You notice things," she said. "Everyone notices things." "Not everyone, and not the way you do." She picked up her bag and stood up. Darnell walked her to the door. On the porch, she paused. "You doing all right?" And she said, "You and Zoe, we're fine." She nodded once, the nod of someone who's accepted the answers and also heard what it didn't include. "Good summer for gardening," she said, and went down the walk. Darnell stood in the doorway and watched her go. Then he went back inside, and he sat down at the kitchen table in the spot she'd been sitting. He sat there for a while without doing anything in particular, not thinking about the file, and not thinking about Ethan or the light aimed at his office window or the trucks parked past the line. Just sitting. It was the closest thing he allowed himself to stillness. The second incident happened the following Tuesday. Zoe had a friend visiting, and Derek Nash, who'd grown up 3 streets over and had known Zoe since 6th grade. He was 19 now, doing a gap year before starting college in the fall. A good kid. Quiet in a way that was genuine rather than performed, which Darnell had always respected, and they were in the backyard. The fence that ran along the property line between Darnell's lot and the Bellamy lot was old wood, about 6 feet, with the climbing vine Claire had planted along the bottom years ago. The vine had come back strong this spring, and running the whole length of the fence in a way that had always made the yard feel more private than it was. Darnell was inside, working. He heard voices from outside first. Ethan's voice, and then another from the gym, someone who'd been over twice already this week, and then something hitting the fence. Rhythmic, like a kick, and again, Darnell closed the laptop. He didn't rush. He came through the back door and stopped on the porch. And Ethan was on the other side of the fence line, technically still on the Bellamy property, but standing close enough that his foot had been connecting with the wood. The vine on their side was already disturbed, and several stems pulled loose, leaves on the ground. Zoe was standing a few feet away, facing him, not backing up but not moving toward him either. Derek was a step behind her, holding still. "Been doing it every morning," Ethan was saying. "Vibrations carry, and I feel it through the foundation." "You can't feel a vine on a fence through your foundation," Zoe said. "I don't know what to tell you, because I do. That's not how physics works. And you a physics major?" "I'm a common sense major." Ethan smiled. Wrong kind of smile. "Got a mouth on you," he said. That from him, Darnell came down the porch steps, crossed the yard, stopped at the fence. Ethan looked at him. Same calculation as before, running faster, and landing on the same answer. "Sir," Ethan said, with just enough of the word to mean something other than respect. "That vine," Darnell said, "was planted by my wife, and he said it the way he said most things. Low, level, no extra weight on any one word." Ethan looked at the vine. Back at Darnell. "I'll trim it from my side if it's bothering you," Darnell said, "but you don't touch it from yours." Something moved across Ethan's face, and not embarrassment. Calculation. He was gauging what this moment was worth. Whether to push or let it ride, he let it ride. "Wasn't touching it," he said, and walked away, and Darnell stood at the fence, looking at the disturbed leaves on the ground, the pulled stems. He bent down and tucked the loose vine ends back against the fence where they'd been growing. Careful. like it was just a gardening task on an ordinary afternoon. And when he stood back up, Zoe had gone inside. Derek was still in the yard. "You all right?" Darnell said. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, "Zoe, who is your dad?" Not a question, and just the words. Darnell looked at the back door. "She's fine," he said. "Go make sure." He went inside. That night, he sat at the kitchen table after Zoe had gone to bed, in the chair he always sat in, the one across from the one Claire used to take, and he'd never actively decided not to sit in her chair. It had just never occurred to him to do it, and after a while it had stopped being a decision and become something else he didn't have a word for, and he thought about what Gloria had said. You notice things. He noticed them, cataloged them. His responded in the appropriate measure and kept the rest sealed away in the part of himself that didn't surface in ordinary life. That was discipline. And that was what you built over 16 years of being the person in the room who needed to know what was actually happening, while making sure nobody knew you were reading them. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. And the problem was that lately, sitting across from Zoe at dinner, watching her choose her words carefully, and watching her be okay in the way that meant something underneath was not okay. He was starting to wonder if there was a version of that skill with costs he hadn't finished calculating, and he heard Claire's voice sometimes, not as a hallucination, not literally, just as a quality of attention, the particular way she'd always said his name when she thought he was disappearing into his own head, and 2 syllables, like a hand on the shoulder. "Make sure Zoe knows you as more than what they asked of you over there." He had been so certain he understood what she meant. He had been so certain. He sat in the chair for a long time, and then he got up and locked the back door and turned off the lights and went to bed and was asleep within 2 minutes, because that was a thing he could still do, and he had long since stopped asking whether it was a gift or something else entirely. And a few days later, Darnell checked the secure portal. The secondary verification had processed overnight. The name of the primary company contact for BF 922 was attached to the file. He already knew it. But seeing it there in federal type, Conrad Bellamy, Chief Executive, Bellamy Freight LLC, made it real in a way that standing at his front window with a coffee cup had not. He pulled up his conflict of interest checklist, standard form, routine, and question 7. Do you have any personal or professional relationship with any principals of the company under review? And he stared at that question. No, he typed. Not at this time, which was accurate. He had shaken hands with Conrad Bellamy twice. He had exchanged words with Conrad's son on 3 occasions. None of that was a relationship. None of that was a conflict. He closed the form, and he went back to page 47 of the maintenance audit. He read until midnight. He made 4 notes. He went to bed. The thing about Cedar Lane at 5 in the morning was that the street didn't know anything about you, and it didn't know what was in the file on your desk or what was in the locked drawer in your office. It didn't know that you had spent 16 years in places that didn't appear on maps civilians used, doing things that wouldn't appear in any public record, and it didn't know about the 2 years when your wife was sick and you came home whenever you could, and it was never enough. And both of you knew it was never going to be enough. And the street just sat there, damp in the morning light, quiet, a few birds starting up somewhere past the park, the gas station sign still blinking at the corner, faithful and pointless. Darnell ran, left on Cedar, right on Birch, past the elementary school, past the gas station, and he ran the way he did everything, steadily, without waste, with the full knowledge that there was no version of the route where running faster would make him arrive somewhere different. He came back past the Bellamy house, and the lights were off. The driveway was still. He ran past it without slowing down, turned into his own driveway, stretched for 4 minutes on the porch, same sequence, same order, went inside, made coffee, and waited for the day to begin, because that was what you did, and you waited. You watched, you stayed in your lane, and you trusted the process, and you did not let the noise outside your window change what was happening inside your chest. He was good at that, and he had always been good at that. He was starting to wonder very quietly, in the part of his mind he didn't show to anyone, whether being good at it had ever come with a cost he hadn't finished paying. He drank his coffee. The street outside came alive, and Cedar Lane woke up and didn't ask him any questions. That was still fine. It was just fine. But somewhere down the block, in a house with 2 green and white trucks in the driveway, A man named Conrad Bellamy was already on the phone with his lawyer, and the cost Darnell hadn't finished calculating was about to come due. The call came on a Wednesday morning in the third week of June, not to Darnell, to someone else entirely. He wouldn't know about it for another 10 days, and, by then, the shape of everything on Cedar Lane would have already started to change in ways that couldn't be walked back. Conrad Bellamy was in his home office when his lawyer called, and the office was still half-unpacked boxes stacked against one wall, the desk itself clear because Conrad worked the way he did everything, the surface in front of him always clean, regardless of what was piling up around it, and his lawyer's name was Frank Doyle. Frank had been with Conrad for 11 years, and he did not call on Wednesday mornings unless something needed to be dealt with before it got worse. "I found him," Frank said. Conrad leaned back in his chair. "Tell me." And Department of Defense, independent contractor. Federal Security Reviewer. He's been assigned to BF 922 since April. A pause. He's been your neighbor for 3 weeks. Conrad was quiet for a moment. "How sure are you?" And contract number matches. The assignment is his. Conrad looked out the window at the driveway, the trucks, the street beyond. The quiet house 2 doors down where a man in gardening gloves had stood at a fence and told his son to apologize. "All right," he said. "Conrad, and this changes things." "It changes some things," Conrad said. "Not everything." He ended the call. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk. Then he picked up the phone again and started making a different kind of call. And Darnell was in the garden when all of this was happening. He didn't know it yet, and he was working down the row of tomatoes in the early morning and staking the ones that had grown fastest, and hands in the dirt, and the street quiet behind the fence, and Zoe had come out with coffee around 8 and sat on the back steps. They talked the way they sometimes matched, in the morning, easy, broken, nothing asked that required too much. "You eat?" And he said, "I'll eat. That's not what I asked. I'll eat when I'm hungry, Dad." He looked at her over his shoulder. She was watching a bird work through the far edge of the garden, coffee cup at her chin. He went back to the tomatoes. This was how their mornings went. Not bad, and not close either, and not in the way he knew they could be, and the way they used to be when she was 12, and had opinions about everything and shared all of them, and sometimes at the same time. And there was warmth here. There just wasn't depth, and he didn't know how to close that distance in a way that felt real rather than effortful. He had 16 years of training in entering situations and reading them and adapting, and he did not know how to get from this back porch to the version of himself his daughter deserved, which said something. He wasn't sure what. 3 days later, Conrad stopped him in the driveway, casual, the way Conrad did everything, and casual and deliberate at the same time, the seams invisible, unless you knew to look for them. He'd come around the corner from his property with a coffee cup in one hand, and the ease of a man who considered his comfort zone to extend about 100 feet in every direction. And Darnell, like they were old friends. "Conrad, beautiful morning." He looked up at the sky. "We got lucky with the weather this summer." "We did." And a pause. The comfortable kind for Conrad. The kind a man uses when he's deciding which direction to steer. "I've been meaning to ask federal work, you said. Dode type of thing?" "Something like that. Funny thing." Conrad looked into his coffee cup and got a word from our legal team last week. Some federal review process on a contract bid we've got in. Standard thing, I assume. You'd think for a contract that size they'd give you a name and somebody to talk to. Darnell kept his expression exactly where it was. "That's government," he said. Conrad watched him for half a second. Something moved behind his eyes. Small. Quick, the confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Well," he said, "easy again, and I won't keep you." He went back to his property. Darnell stood in his driveway. He understood precisely what had just happened. Conrad hadn't asked that question because he didn't know the answer. He'd asked it to see what Darnell did when he heard it, and to see if there was a flinch, a hesitation, anything readable. Darnell had given him nothing, but the conversation itself was the tell. Conrad Bellamy already knew, and now Conrad knew that Darnell knew. And both of them were going to spend the next stretch of time pretending otherwise, while each one calculated what came next. Darnell went inside. He put the coffee cup in the sink. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden for a while. And Carl Owens, 51 years old, modified wheelchair, rented apartment, 14 months and counting. He went back to his desk. He kept working. He sat with what he now knew for 2 days before he did anything about it. Not because he didn't know what he was supposed to do, and he knew exactly flag the potential conflict. Let the department decide whether to reassign or add oversight. Let the process handle it. But the file on Carl Owens kept pulling him back, and the maintenance logs that weren't missing but removed. The careful absence of 4 months of records by someone who knew where to look. A man in a wheelchair who hadn't received so much as a formal acknowledgement from the company whose truck had put him there. 14 months. And if Darnell flagged the conflict now, before the review was complete, before the findings were locked in the file, would get reassigned. Which was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. But reassignment meant weeks, maybe months. And in those weeks, Conrad Bellamy would have time to prepare, time to build a counter case, time to make sure the next reviewer got the version of events Conrad's lawyers had been constructing since the accident. And Darnell sat at his desk and thought about that. He didn't reach a clean answer, so he kept working. The article appeared on a Friday, a local news blog, small audience, and the kind of site that ran zoning disputes and high school sports, and the occasional piece of local outrage that spread further than its origin. And the headline was 7 words. Federal reviewer has history of force misconduct allegations. Darnell found it through a news alert he kept running on his own name. Standard practice. Something his contact at the department had recommended when he took the role 4 years ago. And know what's out there before someone else does. He read it at 11:15 at night. Zoe was asleep. The house was quiet. He read it twice. The article cited a 2011 internal Navy investigation, and Darnell Osei, then active SEAL, had been the subject of a complaint alleging excessive force during a domestic training exercise, and the complaint had been filed by a civilian contractor present during the incident. The article stopped there. It did not mention that the investigation had closed 6 weeks after it opened, and it did not mention the finding complaint unfounded, insufficient evidence, no action taken. It did not include the 6-page internal review that detailed exactly what had happened that day. A training exercise gone wrong, and a civilian who'd been somewhere he shouldn't have been, and blamed the nearest available target. An inquiry that fell apart completely once the other witnesses gave their accounts. None of that. Just the allegation, just the year, just his name. He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark. He wasn't angry, and anger was a reaction, and reactions required a triggering event, and he had seen something like this coming since Conrad had stood in the driveway and run his quiet little test. This was the play. Build a record, create an image, and former soldier, history of force allegations, reviewing the company next door. And when the finding came in against Bellamy Freight, the objection would already be waiting. This man had a personal conflict and a documented history of aggression. The finding was compromised. The file gets reopened. Clean, patient, and the kind of move a man made when he'd played this game before. Darnell turned the laptop back on. He opened the federal ethics portal. He looked at the conflict of interest form he'd filled out weeks ago. He changed it. He closed the portal, and he went to bed. He lay in the dark for 6 minutes before sleep came, which was longer than usual. He did not tell Zoe about the article. He told himself this was because she didn't need the weight of it. She was home for the summer, and she was doing her coursework and spending time with Derek and eating dinners with him at the kitchen table. She didn't need to carry his professional problems. He told himself that. It was the same thing he'd been telling himself for 3 years about a lot of things. And the incident at the fence happened on a Saturday in mid-July. Zoe was in the backyard with Derek, and they had the small folding table out, and Zoe had her laptop, and Derek had a book, and they were doing the thing young people do where they're in the same space without being in the same activity, which looked like company and felt like it too. Darnell was inside, and he could see them through the kitchen window. He heard it start, and Ethan's voice from the Bellamy side of the fence. Then 2 others, the gym friends who'd been over a handful of times, young and loud in the way that comes from never having been asked to be quiet for anything that actually mattered. Then the sound of impact against wood, and he recognized it from 2 rooms away. He came out through the back door. Ethan was on the other side of the fence, foot connecting with the base of it, and, not a full kick, more like pressure, testing. The vine along the bottom was already disturbed, broken stems on the ground from where he was standing. Zoe had stood up from the table. "The vine grows onto our property," Ethan was saying. "That's a boundary issue, and it's on our side of the fence," Zoe said. "The fence is the line. Anything touching the fence, Ethan." Darnell's voice was low enough that it shouldn't have carried across the yard, and it did. Ethan looked up. The two gym friends shifted position slightly, not backing up, just recalibrating. Darnell walked across the yard and stopped at the fence. He looked at the broken stems on the ground. He looked at Ethan. "My wife planted that vine," he said, "and she planted it before she got sick. She planted it before she died, so you're going to stop touching it." Silence. Then Ethan moved forward, not backward. He came around the edge of the fence onto Darnell's side of the property line and closed the space between them. And he was taller by 3 inches and using all of them, chin up and shoulders forward, and doing the thing he did in the cage before an opponent when he wanted to establish the hierarchy before the first exchange. And he shoved Darnell, both hands, center of the chest. What happened next took less time than it took Derek to inhale. Darnell didn't resist the movement. He turned into it and used the contact, used the forward pressure of it, and had Ethan's wrist in his hand, and Ethan's center of gravity broken before Ethan could register that his push hadn't connected with what he expected, and the ground came up fast. Ethan landed in the grass on one knee, one hand down, the world having rearranged itself around him in under a second. No punch, no follow-through. Darnell released his wrist and stepped back. Ethan stayed on the ground for a moment, and not because he was hurt, because he was recalculating something very fast and the calculation wasn't finishing the way he expected. He looked up at Darnell. Darnell looked back. "You can get up," Darnell said, and then held out a hand. Ethan stared at the hand, then took it. Darnell pulled him to his feet and let go immediately. Ethan stood there. His friends were very quiet. "Go home," Darnell said. "Don't come back to this side of the fence." Ethan said nothing, and he turned and walked back through the gap in the fence line. His friends fell in behind him. Darnell watched them go. Then he turned around. Zoe was looking at him. Derek was looking at him, and he looked at them both for a moment. Then he bent down, picked up the broken vine stems from the grass, and set them at the base of the fence. "You all right?" he said to Zoe. "Yeah," she said. But she was still looking at him, and like she was seeing something she didn't have a category for yet. He went inside. Conrad came over that evening, not with a coffee cup this time, and he stood on the porch. Darnell heard the footsteps and came to the door before he got the chance to knock, and he was in a register Darnell recognized immediately and controlled anger, the kind that was more useful than the real thing because you could deploy it and withdraw it at will. He talked for 6 minutes. Darnell listened to all of it, and there was a lot about his son's career and his son's training and the kind of incident that could affect a young athlete's reputation and sponsorship prospects. There was something about an attorney Conrad golfed with who had a strong track record with civil matters, and there was something else about a city councilman who owed Conrad a favor in a way that had nothing to do with anything legal. Exactly, and none of it was a threat. All of it was a threat. When Conrad finished, he stood there waiting for the response, the denial or the explanation or the flinch. Darnell said, "Your son entered my property without permission and put his hands on me. I have witnesses, and you should talk to your attorney." Conrad's jaw moved slightly. "Have a good night, Conrad," Darnell said. He closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment, and then he went to his desk and opened the BF 922 file and sat with it for a long time without reading any of it. And he was thinking about Carl Owens again. He was thinking about how a man waits 14 months, and the people responsible for what happened to him spend that time building walls. And he was thinking about how every wall Conrad had put up since arriving on Cedar Lane had been aimed at one thing, not at Darnell personally, at the file, and at the signature at the bottom of the finding that would determine whether Bellamy Freight ever touched another federal contract. He understood now, completely, what he was dealing with. The question was what he was going to do about it. The nights got harder after that, not because of Conrad, not because of the article, which had stopped spreading once nothing new fed it, but because of Zoe, and he could feel her watching him differently. Not with fear, with attention. The attention someone brings to a thing they've been told doesn't exist and have just seen with their own eyes, and she didn't ask him about it. He didn't offer. He sat at the kitchen table 4 nights after the fence incident and looked at the chair across from him and thought about Claire with a clarity that sometimes snuck up on him when he wasn't managing well enough against it. And she had never liked the silence, not the comfortable kind. She'd loved that. Sunday mornings, both of them reading, nothing needing to be said. That silence she'd called breathing room. But the other kind, the kind where something needed to be said and the words existed, and nobody was using them, she'd called that holding your breath. He'd been holding his breath for 3 years. He was starting to notice what it was doing to his face, and the envelope arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of July. Department of Health and Human Services, Child Protective Services Division. Darnell opened it at the kitchen table. Read it once, and read it again. An anonymous complaint had been filed. Concerns regarding a possibly threatening and dangerous home environment. A mandatory preliminary inquiry was required. A caseworker would be in contact. Tangible. He set the letter on the table. He sat with it, and he thought, of course. Not surprised, not even close to surprised. This was the next move. He'd seen it coming, since Conrad had stood on the porch with his carefully calibrated anger and his attorney's name and his city councilman. And this was what you did when you couldn't get to the man directly. You made him defend a second front. He called his attorney that afternoon. Her name was Sheila Abrams. She'd handled his contract work for 3 years, sharp and patient, and she did not make him feel like an idiot for not seeing things coming. They need documented evidence that your home is stable, she said. It is stable, I know that. You need paperwork that says it. And a pause. Darnell. The fastest way through this is to release the relevant service records. Character documentation, the sealed commendation files. He was quiet. You're thinking that keeping those files sealed is protecting Zoe, she said. That if she doesn't know the specifics of what you did over there, she can have a normal relationship with who you are now. He didn't answer. She's 20, Sheila said. Not unkindly. And whatever you're protecting her from, she's old enough to decide whether she needs that protection. And the line was quiet. Get me the files, Sheila said. Let me know what you decide. He hung up. He sat at his desk. The bottom drawer was in his peripheral vision. He did not open it, not yet. He opened it that night, 2 in the morning. Zoe was asleep, and he'd been lying in the dark, unable to do the thing he usually did without effort, and finally gave up and went to the desk. He took the key off the hook, and the drawer was deep, organized by year, clearly labeled. Commendations, after-action reports. A physical citation from a ceremony he hadn't attended because he'd been in the field, a photograph he never looked at directly. He went through them slowly, and he read the language they used. Precise, formal third person. The language of documents that needed to convey weight without conveying feeling. And he read words that described a version of himself. He'd spent 3 years trying to put distance between himself and the man sitting at this desk right now. And he'd thought the distance was respect. He was starting to think it might have been something else. He was at the bottom of the drawer when his hand found it. A small notebook, spiral-bound. Blue cover, water-stained at one corner, and Claire's name written on the first page in her own hand, and a date from 4 years ago. He sat very still. He hadn't known this was here. He'd put things in this drawer for 3 years, and he hadn't known this was at the bottom of it, which meant someone else had placed it here. At some point in the weeks after Claire's death, when Darnell was not in a state to account for where things were or weren't going, he looked at the lock housing on the drawer. There was a faint scratch along the edge of it, and the kind you leave when you're working a key in the dark, not entirely sure of the angle. Zoe. He was almost certain it was Zoe. His hands were not entirely steady when he opened it, and Claire's handwriting filled the pages. Notes, thoughts, observations, the kind of notebook some keeps not to record events, but to work through the interior of them. He didn't read all of it, and he moved through carefully, respectful of the privacy of it, even though the person who'd written it was 3 years gone and would have told him to read every word. He stopped at the last page with writing on it. The handwriting was different here, and she'd written it near the end, and the letters showed it, and slanted in a way her handwriting wasn't when she was well. Slower, more deliberate, like she was concentrating hard on each word because she knew she didn't have many more left. He read it. It was short. It was not the thing he'd remembered, and not the thing he'd been carrying for 3 years as the version of what she'd asked of him. She'd written, When you think about what I asked, don't hide from Zoe. I didn't say hide the hard parts. And I said let her see why you came home. That's what I meant. The reason you came back. She deserves to know she was the reason. He read it twice. He set the notebook down on the desk. He sat in the dark for a long time, and he had spent 3 years protecting his daughter from the weight of who he'd been. And he had never once sat down and told her why he'd left the Navy, why he'd come home, and what had been worth more to him than the work and the team and the life he'd built inside those 16 years. She had been the reason, she and Claire together. But Claire was gone and Zoe was here, and he had never said it, not once, and not in 3 years of dinners at the kitchen table and mornings on the back porch, and all the quiet hours of a shared house where neither of them reached for the thing that was right there between them. And he'd been so certain the silence was the gift. He sat with the notebook open on the desk until the sky outside the window started to go from black to gray. Then he closed it. He left it on the desk. He didn't put it back. 3 days later, Zoe walked into the office, and mid-afternoon, he was at the desk. She knocked on the open door not because she needed to, just because she did. "Hey," she said. "Hey," and she came in, sat in the chair across from the desk that nobody ever sat in. She looked at the desk. At the notebook sitting there in plain sight, she looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I put that in there," she said, after. "I didn't know where else to put it, and I know. Did you read it?" "Yes." Silence. Slowly, like she was filing something away. "And I've read it," she said. "The whole thing. I read it the summer after she died." She looked at her hands. "She talks about you a lot. It's mostly about you. About wanting you to stop carrying things alone." She paused. She knew you wouldn't know how. He looked at her. She looked back. "And I don't need you to be different than you are," she said. "I just need you to stop being away, even when you're in the same room." And he didn't have an answer. She didn't seem to need one. She stood up, looked at the notebook on the desk. "You can leave it out," she said. "You don't have to put it back." She left. He sat there for a long time. He didn't put it back. And what Darnell didn't know was that Zoe already knew more than he thought. She'd been home all summer. She was observant. And she'd grown up watching a man who assessed rooms without appearing to, who noticed things without looking like he was noticing, who processed information at a speed that was invisible unless you'd spent 20 years in the same house with him. And she had. She'd tracked the conversations with Conrad in the driveway. She'd watched her father's expression go careful when Ethan's name came up. She'd clocked 6 weeks of small escalations the way she'd learned to by watching him. She hadn't told him any of this, and she'd been keeping a log, notes app on her phone buried in a folder. 6 weeks of dates and times the truck parked wrong, the fence, each incident with Ethan, and she'd found the article on her own, 2 days after it ran, and sat with it in her room for an hour before deciding what to do about it. And she hadn't told her father she'd read it. She'd called Derek. "You still have that video?" she said. "Which one from the fence? The Saturday thing?" Derek was quiet. "You told me you backed it up," she said. "Yeah, I did." "Where?" "Cloud. My personal account, not the one on my phone." And she exhaled slowly. "Good," she said. "Don't delete it. Don't move it. Don't tell anyone about it yet." A long pause. "And Zoe, what are you doing?" "I'm keeping it somewhere safe," she said. "Just leave it where it is." "Okay," Derek said. She didn't tell her father about the call. Not yet. There was a time for that. She was waiting for it. The caseworker came on a Thursday. Her name was Beverly Holt, and early 40s. Methodical, with the professional steadiness of someone who had spent years walking into homes where things were complicated and learning to see clearly anyway. And she sat in the living room with Zoe for 20 minutes, while Darnell waited in the kitchen. He stayed in the chair. Every instinct told him to pace. He stayed in the chair. He heard the murmur of conversation. He heard Zoe laugh once, briefly, and he heard Beverly Holt's voice ask a question, low and even. When she came into the kitchen, her folder was closed. "Your daughter is very clear," she said, consistent. "Nothing in this home gives me any actual concern." And she looked at him with the look of someone in her job who had developed an accurate read on people and trusted it. "The file stays open for a follow-up. That's standard. It's not a reflection on what I found today." "I understand," Darnell said. "Thank you for coming in person." And she left. Darnell went back to the kitchen table. He sat in the chair for a while. Then he heard Zoe's footsteps on the stairs. She came into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. "She was fine," Zoe said. "I know. I told her about Mom," she asked. He nodded. Zoe set the glass down. She looked at him steadily. Dad, she said, yeah, I need you to talk to me. He looked at her. Not about the case. And I know there's a case. I know more than you think I do. She put her hand flat on the table. And I'm not asking you to tell me everything. I'm asking you to stop pretending this isn't happening. Because it is, and I'm in it, and I'm not 12. No, he said, you're not 12, so talk to me. The kitchen was very quiet. There's a file, he said, and a federal review. The company belongs to Conrad Bellamy. She didn't look surprised, which told him everything he needed to know about what she'd already put together on her own. And I'm the reviewing officer, he said. I'm supposed to be neutral. Conrad found out who I was. He's been trying to create a reason for me to look like I'm not. The article, she said. He looked at her. I found it, she said, 2 days after it ran. He sat back. She waited. And you could have told me, she said. I didn't want to. I know what you didn't want. Not angry. Just clear. But I needed to know. And then you made that choice for me. He was quiet. She was right. He was sitting with being right with her in the specific way that didn't have a defense, that wasn't also an admission. He'd made the choice for her, and he'd been making choices for her for 3 years in the name of protecting her from weight she hadn't asked to be protected from. I'm sorry, he said. He said it plainly. No qualifications, no redirect. She looked at him, and he thought she might say something more. She reached across the table and set her hand briefly on top of his. Then she pulled it back, stood up. I'm going to help, she said. Whatever comes next. I'm not sitting on the sidelines. She went upstairs, and Darnell sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the hand she'd put on his, at the notebook on his desk through the open office door, at the garden through the window, the tomatoes heavy on the vine in the late afternoon light, and he thought about Carl Owens. He thought about 14 months. He thought about what it meant to wait for someone to look at the facts and say what they actually were. He was going to see this through. He was going to see it through the right way. And he just had to get there without giving Conrad Bellamy the opening he'd been building toward all summer. He was very good at not giving openings. The question was whether good would be enough. And outside on Cedar Lane, the evening was settling. Porch lights coming on. A neighbor's dog somewhere down the block. The sound of someone's screen door. The street that didn't ask questions, it still didn't ask them. But the answers were coming anyway, and whether anyone on Cedar Lane was ready for them or not. Labor Day fell on the first Monday of September. The air had started to change by then. Still warm in the afternoons, but the mornings carried something different, and a thinness at the edge of the heat. The first suggestion of the season turning over into something cooler and more honest. The tomatoes in the back garden had peaked and were coming in heavy now. More than 2 people could reasonably keep up with. And Darnell had been leaving bags of them at Gloria Marsh's door. Same as Claire used to. He noticed that he was doing it the 3rd time he did it, and stood on Gloria's porch with the bag in his hand and understood, without making a big thing of it, that some habits weren't replacements, and they were just continuations. The same kindness moving through a different pair of hands. He went home and made coffee, and didn't think about it any further. The cookout was a Cedar Lane tradition. Gloria organized it, which meant it happened the same way every year, and folding tables on the shared lawn between properties. Grills borrowed from whoever had the biggest one. People cycling through in shifts from 11 in the morning until the light went flat and the mosquitoes made staying outside a matter of genuine commitment. And Darnell had gone every year since they'd moved to the street. Even the first Labor Day after Claire died, when he hadn't wanted to go and Zoe had stood in the kitchen doorway and not said anything, and he'd understood that she needed him to show up, so he'd stood near the edge of the gathering with a paper plate and talked to Gary from 3 doors down about nothing in particular, and come home 2 hours later feeling neither better nor worse, which was about what he'd been hoping for. And this year, Zoe wanted to go. She said it casually, the Sunday evening before, pouring coffee at the counter. Not asking, not checking, just stating it the way she stated things she'd already decided. I kind of want to go tomorrow, she said. Okay, he said. You? I'll be there. And she nodded. Poured her coffee. That was the whole conversation. But something about it felt different than the conversations they'd been having all summer. Less managed. Like she was just talking to him instead of navigating around him, and he noticed that too. He didn't make a big thing of it. On his run that morning, he noticed that the Bellamy driveway had 2 extra cars in it, alongside Ethan's black pickup and Conrad's sedan. Vehicles he didn't recognize, and the kind that belonged to young men who traveled in groups and considered their presence in any space to be self-evidently welcome. He finished his route, came home, stretched on the porch. He thought about the call he'd had with Sheila Abrams on Friday, and she'd said the department had received a formal request for his removal from the BF 922 file, not through normal channels, and through a chain of contacts that had traveled upward through several layers of the kind of professional relationships that ran on favors and golf handicaps and the unspoken understanding that some people could make certain calls and expect them to land somewhere useful. And the chain had eventually reached a man named Roy Stanton. Sheila didn't know Stanton. Darnell did. Stanton had been his commanding officer during the last 4 years of his service, and he'd signed off on the deployments that didn't appear in public records. He'd sat across from Darnell in rooms overseas that neither of them would ever publicly describe. He now consulted independently for the Department on Contractor Security Matters, which meant he sat exactly where Conrad's chain of contacts had aimed. Darnell had not called Stanton. He'd thought about it twice. Both times he'd arrived at the same place. And this wasn't a situation where he called in the old relationships. And this was a situation where he did the work correctly and let the work stand on its own. He hadn't built his career on anything else, and he wasn't going to start now. And what he didn't know, standing on his porch stretching his left knee, was that Roy Stanton had already made his own decision about what to do. The cookout started early, and by 11:30 the tables were out, and the first grills were going, and the smell of it reached driveway, before Darnell and Zoe even turned the corner from the house, and kids running on the grass, the Pattersons from the far end of the street. A couple of families Darnell knew well enough to wave to, and a few he'd met once or twice and could place by face, if not by name. Gloria was at the center of it the way she always was, not directing, and just the fixed point everything else organized around. She found Darnell within the first 10 minutes. "Brought tomatoes," he said, holding up the bag, and she took it without ceremony. "Already more than enough tomatoes." She kept it anyway. "You look like you're doing math." "I'm not. You always do math in public." She looked past him toward the lawn. "Zoe looks good." He turned, and Zoe was across the grass, talking to someone from the street, smiling, gesturing with her cup. She looked easy. She looked like herself, which was not always the version of herself that made it all the way to the surface, and he'd been noticing it more lately. The version of her that was just present instead of managed. "She does," he said. Gloria looked at him for a moment with the look she used when she'd already said what needed saying and was waiting to see if it had landed. And then she went back to organizing things that didn't need organizing, but made people feel better when she was near them. Darnell found a position near the edge of the gathering, and he could see the parking area from there, the gate, the full spread of the lawn and the tables. He knew he'd done it without consciously deciding to, and he knew why, and he didn't fight it. The habit was the habit, and he let himself watch. His daughter laugh at something someone had said, and held on to the ordinariness of it for the first time all summer, without immediately worrying about what was coming next. And he talked to Gary about the fence along Gary's back property that needed replacing before winter. He ate something from the grill that wasn't bad. He drank half a beer and switched to water because it was warm, and he wanted to stay sharp, which was another habit he didn't fight. He had been there for an hour and 12 minutes when the Bellamy's eyes arrived. He heard Conrad first, and the voice carried the way it always did. Not because it was loud exactly, but because it expected to be heard, and had been for long enough that expectation had become a kind of physics. And Ethan came through the gate behind him. No gym clothes, but no attempt at ordinary either. He was dressed for an audience, which was its own statement. 2 friends behind him, moving in the loose formation of people performing casualness they don't quite feel, and in his right hand, and held loose, and like an afterthought, and a pair of training gloves, and Darnell saw it. He set his water cup down on the nearest folding table. He watched Ethan scan the gathering, watched him locate Darnell, and watched him change direction with the deliberate casualness of someone who has made a decision and is now carrying it out. The lawn went quiet in the way crowds go quiet when they sense something approaching without yet understanding what it is. tables nearby, and people shifting without realizing they'd moved. Ethan stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Darnell. He looked at the lawn around them. Then he dropped the gloves onto the grass between them. They hit the ground with a flat sound that traveled further than it should have, and last time didn't get settled right, he said. Loud enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear every word. Phones beginning to rise around the edges of the gathering. Today we settle it, right here, in front of everybody. No confusion about how this went, and Darnell didn't look at the gloves. He took 1 step sideways, putting himself between Ethan and the place where Zoe was standing 20 feet back near the food table. 1 step. That was all. But it was deliberate, and it was visible, and everyone watching understood what it meant. No, he said, just that word. Ethan laughed. The version he used for audiences rather than for himself, built for the phones. See, that's what I thought, he said. And you stand there like you're above it, like you're so controlled, but what you actually are is scared, and everybody here knows it. Go enjoy the cookout, Ethan. I'm talking to you. I hear you. And Darnell kept his voice at the same level it had been since the conversation started. I'm not fighting you. Conrad appeared at Ethan's shoulder. He'd been watching from the edge of things, and now he moved forward with the expression of a man watching a calculation proceed on schedule. You put your hands on my son, he said, on his own property. I've been patient. This is the chance to handle it clean. There's nothing to handle, Darnell said. And your son entered my property without permission and put his hands on me first. I have witnesses. That conversation already happened, and Conrad said something about hospital costs, and making sure there were no complications afterward, said it in the tone of a man who had thought through the statement carefully enough to make it sound like concern while meaning something entirely different. Ethan moved closer and said Claire's name. He said it the way someone says a name when they've been told it will land, and they want to watch where. And he said something about a woman he'd never met, about what kind of man lets his wife's memory sit behind a fence line while he hides inside his own silence and calls it strength. He turned to where Zoe was standing. That the lesson? And he said, loud enough for the row of tables behind him. Stand there and take it? That what you're teaching her? That holding still is the same thing as being strong? Darnell stood very still, and the lawn was quiet in a way that outdoor spaces rarely are. No birds, no wind, just people not moving and not speaking, and the sound of a few phones still recording. Then Darnell turned. He turned to walk away, not because Ethan had reached anything real, and not because of anything that had been said. He turned because removing himself from this, getting Zoe out of the middle of it, taking the audience away, refusing to give Conrad the footage he'd been building toward all summer, that was still the move that protected the most people, and including himself. He was 3 steps away when Ethan reached past him, got his hand on Zoe's arm. Not hard, not a grab exactly, just enough. Enough to stop her from following her father, enough to make her stumble when the contact caught her off balance. She went down. And, not thrown just the physics of unexpected force on an unprepared body. Her palm hit the edge of the pavement where the lawn met the path, and she caught herself on one hand and sat there for a moment, with blood coming up across her palm in a thin, bright line. And Darnell turned around. Everything he had spent 3 years holding in the same careful place came apart in that instant. Not into anger, into clarity. And the specific, total clarity of a man who has just reached the one line he'd known from the beginning he would not allow to be crossed, and finds that the line is exactly where he thought it was. He came back across the grass. He went to Zoe first. He crouched down and checked her hand, the skin across the palm, and not deep, and not serious, and but real. And she was already pulling herself up. He helped her. He looked at her face, and she looked back at him. And whatever she saw in his expression in that moment, she didn't look away from it. I'm okay, she said. He nodded. He looked for Gloria, and she was already moving toward them from the near table, reading the situation without being told what to do about it. He got Zoe to her feet and guided her toward Gloria, and Gloria put a hand on Zoe's shoulder, and that was enough. And then Darnell turned. He walked back toward Ethan. He stopped. He looked at him with nothing left to manage or weigh or hold back. Apologize to her, he said. The voice was low, lower than anything he'd said since the conversation started, and it had a quality that people who heard it would not be able to describe precisely, but would not forget. Leave the cookout. Right now. This ends here if you walk away. Ethan pulled on the gloves, and he glanced back at his friends, at the phones, at the audience he'd spent this whole summer building toward. "I'm going to make sure she watches them carry you off this lawn," he said, "so everyone on this street finally understands which family runs things here." Darnell reached up, and he was wearing a flannel shirt over a gray undershirt. He unbuttoned it, folded it once, set it on the edge of the nearest folding table, and the motion was unhurried and exact, the way he did everything. And when he turned to face the open patch of grass where Ethan was already moving into position, the lawn was so quiet, you could hear the folding table creak slightly when he lifted his hand from it, and Ethan opened fast. A combination that had worked in actual cage fights against actual trained opponents. And his hands moved the way well-trained hands moved, sharp, committed, the kind of sequence that relied on speed and forward pressure, and the understanding that most opponents could not handle both at once. Darnell slipped the first strike, and he moved into the empty space beside Ethan's forward shoulder and used the momentum of the combination against its owner, redirecting the forward pressure so that Ethan's face met the grass in front of the entire assembled cookout before he'd registered what had happened, and a few people laughed before they caught themselves. That sound did more damage to Ethan's composure than the fall had. Ethan pushed up, reset. He was good enough to reset. That was the real thing about genuine training. It didn't disappear the first time the ground came up fast. And he circled. Darnell circled with him. Ethan threw the spinning kick, the one that had been in his highlight footage, the one that looked like a statement and usually was, and Darnell read the plant foot, closed the distance before the technique could fully extend, hooked the standing leg, and brought the center of gravity down. Ethan fell a second time, but the kick connected on the way down, partial, and the shin caught Darnell's left shoulder as the technique broke apart and continued on its arc. He felt it. He took a half step back from it. A sharp sound went through the crowd, not a laugh this time. Something more like recognition, and that this was not going to be clean. That the man they'd been watching for weeks, the quiet one from 2 doors down, was not untouchable. Nobody laughed after that. Ethan got to his feet with his knee scraped raw and something different in his face. Not defeat, not yet, but the first real recognition that he had walked into something he had badly misjudged from the first afternoon he crossed the driveway. He looked toward Conrad at the edge of the lawn, and Conrad was shouting, telling him to get up, feeding him just enough pressure to close over whatever instinct toward self-preservation had begun forming in Ethan's chest. Ethan surged forward, and full takedown attempt arms wrapping low around Darnell's waist, trying to drive him backward into the nearest table. And Darnell dropped his hips, turned into the momentum rather than against it, and took Ethan face down into the grass in a hold that pinned both arms and left him with exactly nothing to work with. And Ethan thrashed against the hold, panic beginning to enter his voice for the first time all afternoon. "Tap out," Darnell said quietly. "It's over. There's nothing left to win from here." Ethan did not tap out, more pride than hope. He knew it, and Darnell knew it. And Conrad screamed from the sideline and came across the grass, and knocking a folding chair sideways as he came, ended in the chaos of that moment Conrad's voice, and the crowd shifting, and Ethan still thrashing Ethan's free hand, found something near the edge of the grill setup, and a long-handled barbecue tool, heavy, metal, the kind used to manage coals on a deep grill. He swung it. It missed Darnell by less than a foot, kept traveling in its arc, and toward Zoe, who had broken away from Gloria the moment the shouting turned sharp and frantic, who was coming back across the grass toward her father, because that was what she did and what she had always done. The arc of the rod was carrying directly at her, and there was nothing left to calculate. And Darnell shoved Zoe clear with one arm, and the motion single and complete, and then stripped the rod from Ethan's grip with the other, and sending it spinning across the grass well away from anyone. And then he drove Ethan flat and locked both arms behind his back so completely that he could not move in any direction. The voice Darnell used when he spoke next was not the neighbor's voice, and it was not the voice of the man who waved from the porch in the morning or fixed things in the garden on weekday afternoons. And it was something that had been sitting below all of that for a long time, below 3 years of careful distance and folded flannel shirts and coffee going cold on the porch. And it was flat and precise and entirely certain of itself, and it had a quality that had nothing to do with volume. People standing at the far edge of the lawn heard it without being able to explain how. Nobody moved. Then a man stepped out of the crowd, and 68 years old, white-haired. He moved with a quality the open air seemed to register before the people around him did. He came through the gathered neighbors with the unhurried directness of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He crossed the grass and stopped 4 feet from where Darnell was standing. He looked at Darnell's face. "Commander Osei," Roy Stanton said. "Good evening." 4 words. That was all. The silence that followed those 4 words spread from that spot across the entire lawn, and Conrad stopped shouting mid-sentence. Ethan went still. The phone stayed up, but nobody was narrating anything anymore. Zoe stood at the edge of the space her father had cleared and watched his face, not with fear, and with the focused attention of someone seeing a thing fully for the first time that they had been sensing the outline of for years, like a shape in fog that has finally stepped close enough to be a shape. She didn't look away from it, and Darnell released Ethan's wrists. He checked both shoulders the same way he would after any hold like that, making sure. And then he stood up and stepped back and stood in the middle of the Cedar Lane shared lawn with the flannel shirt folded on a table 15 feet away and the metal rod in the grass and everyone on the street looking at him. Stanton said nothing more. He didn't need to, and Conrad called the police within minutes. And his voice on the phone was the voice of a man building a version of events in real time, former soldier and military trained, an unprovoked attack, and dangerous, and out of control. And the same story he'd been preparing to tell since the first week he'd understood who his neighbor was. The first officer arrived and directed Darnell toward the ground before he'd spoken a word, even with the metal rod lying in plain sight between them. And Gloria Marsh stepped forward. She was 58 years old and had lived on Cedar Lane for 2 decades, and she had a voice that carried when she chose to use it. And the man who just pushed his daughter out of the path of a swinging rod, and she said, and clearly enough for the officer and everyone near him to hear every word, and should not be the first one you're asking to lie face down on the pavement. And the officer hesitated. He looked at the rod, at Ethan, at Darnell standing with both hands visible, and his voice even. The second officer arrived within 4 minutes. By the time statements were being taken, 3 phones had footage of some portion of the afternoon, and Derek Nash, who had been near the grill from the moment Ethan walked through the gate, had started recording when the gloves hit the grass and had not stopped. His footage covered everything. The gloves and the speech. Ethan reaching for Zoe, Zoe going down the rod, Darnell moving to push her clear, and by the time the officers finished taking statements from the neighbors still gathered around, and it was Ethan, and not Darnell, and looking at a possible charge for assault with a dangerous weapon, and Conrad stood at the edge of the grass, looking at the officer explaining this to him, with the expression of a man watching a map he's been certain of for months rearrange itself into something he doesn't recognize, but Conrad was patient. That was the thing about him that had always been the most dangerous part of him. He moved fast when he could. When he couldn't, he waited and adjusted. He hired someone to cut the video before it could spread further and pulled the section showing Ethan reaching for Zoe, pulled the frame with the rod, left the section where Darnell had Ethan face down on the grass with both arms locked, added a headline, "Former soldier attacks young man at neighborhood cookout," and the edited version moved faster than anyone in the Osei household could have anticipated. Zoe saw it the next morning, before she came downstairs, and she was sitting at the top of the stairs when Darnell came out of the kitchen, and he looked up and she had the phone in her hand, and her face had gone to the still place she went when something had hit her, and she wasn't ready to show it yet. And he came up the stairs and sat beside her on the top step, and she handed him the phone. He read the headline, watched 30 seconds of the edited footage, handed it back. "I'm handling it," he said. She looked at him. "But I need you to know," he said, "that handling it doesn't mean the same thing it used to mean." She waited, and "It doesn't mean alone," he said. Something shifted in her face, not relief exactly. More like the absence of the thing that had been sitting where relief wasn't. She leaned her shoulder against his for a moment, and then she stood up and went downstairs to make breakfast, and he sat on the top step a little longer and listened to the sounds of her moving around the kitchen below him. 2 days later, Conrad escalated. and he worked his chain of contacts upward through every professional relationship he'd built across 20 years of knowing the right people in the right rooms. And the chain was long, and it was real, and it was aimed at one outcome: Darnell Osei, removed from the BF 922 review on grounds of bias, conflict of interest, and the documented incident at the neighborhood cookout. And the chain reached Roy Stanton. Conrad didn't know Stanton had been standing 15 feet away on that lawn. He didn't know Stanton had watched the full sequence of events from the moment Ethan dropped the gloves. And he called Stanton the way he called everyone, with the confidence of a man who assumes the person listening has less information than he does. He laid out his case. He described Darnell as unstable, dangerous, and compromised. He mentioned donors. He mentioned a mayor's office. He mentioned a willingness to escalate as high as necessary to see the reviewing officer removed before the finding was filed. Stanton listened to all of it, and then he said, in a tone that gave nothing away about how far beyond appropriate this conversation had already traveled, that the man Conrad wanted removed was among the most trusted officers who had ever served under his direct authority, and that he had personally signed deployment orders he was still not authorized to discuss in public, and that he had been present at the incident Conrad was describing and had watched every moment of it from beginning to end. And he added that the conduct Conrad had just described to him, attempting to pressure a federal reviewer, suppressing evidence, working to intimidate witnesses during an active conduct investigation, was not a personnel complaint, and it was a federal ethics matter with serious legal consequences attached. Before ending the call, Stanton said he intended to document the entire conversation and submit it to the department's ethics review office that same afternoon, and he did. Sheila Abrams called Darnell 2 days later to tell him. He stood at the kitchen window when she told him. Garden. Late-season tomatoes catching the morning light. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. And you could still sign the disqualification yourself, Sheila said when she'd finished. You have the authority. Given everything in the file, the finding would stand. Nobody would question it. No, he said. A pause. I know, she said. I'm recusing. And full submission to the independent board. And everything I have. It's the right call, Darnell. I know it's the right call. He turned away from the window. I just want to say it out loud. She understood. She didn't push. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a while, without doing anything in particular. And he had the authority to end this today. One signature, done on his terms with his name on the outcome. And it would be the wrong way to do it. And, not because the finding was wrong, it wasn't. Because a conclusion that was right needed to arrive in a way that couldn't be picked apart later, needed to come from someone who owed nothing to either side, and needed to be the work standing on its own, instead of standing on his anger, or his satisfaction, or his perfectly legal but absolutely personal desire to be the one holding the pen when it was over. He'd spent 3 years confusing control with strength, and he wasn't going to correct that mistake by trading it for a different version of the same thing. He filed the recusal that afternoon, submitted everything to the independent board, every piece of documentation, every maintenance record analysis, every finding, all of it. And then he stepped back from the file for the first time since April and sat in the quiet of having done the right thing before knowing how it would land. That was the hardest part, always had been. And Zoe called Renee Okafor the next morning. She didn't tell Darnell she was doing it. She told him after, which was different. She'd found Renee through 4 bylines on freight safety pieces the local paper had run over the past year, and 2 of them had mentioned the Owens accident without naming Bellamy Freight. Zoe had read them the same week she'd started keeping her log and filed Renee's name away the way she filed everything quietly, without announcing it. For the moment it became useful, and she called from her room. You've been following Bellamy Freight, she said when Renee picked up. Who is this? Zoe Osei. My father is the federal reviewer on BF 922. A longer pause. I have 6 weeks of documentation, Zoe said. And I have a complete behavioral record on Conrad Bellamy's son, going back to the first week of June. I have the full, unedited video from Labor Day, and I know the name of the attorney who was paid to contact the witnesses from the cookout before statements were taken. And she heard Renee's chair move. When can you meet? Renee said. She told Darnell that evening he was washing the dinner dishes. She sat on the counter the way she'd sat on the counter since she was 9 and too short to see over it. She told him the whole thing, Renee's name, and the bylines she'd found. The call, the meeting scheduled for Thursday. He listened without turning around. When she finished, he turned off the water. He turned around and looked at her. "And you kept records," he said. "Since the beginning, you didn't tell me. You didn't tell me about the file." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she didn't see often, not quite a smile. And the place a smile lives when it's been through enough that it's learned to sit still. "No," he said, "I didn't." She looked back. "So we're even," she said. "We're not even," he said. "You did better." And she looked at the floor, then back up at him. "Renee's going to run the story," she said. "Carl Owens is going to be in it. The full picture." He nodded. "Okay," he said. He turned back to the dishes. She sat on the counter and watched him, and the kitchen was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet all summer. Not the absence of something this time, the presence of it. Two people in the same room not performing anything for each other, and just there. Renee Okafor's story ran on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after Labor Day. It was not about the cookout. It was about Bellamy Freight, 14 months of brake maintenance records that had been removed rather than lost, and Carl Owens and a modified wheelchair and a rented apartment, and 22 months without a formal acknowledgement from the company whose vehicle had put him there, and a pattern of safety compliance violations across 3 years that had been quietly settled before they became public record, and the ethics complaint and the phone call to Stanton. 6 weeks of documented escalation against a federal reviewer. The edited video and the original, side by side, with a timestamp analysis showing exactly what had been cut and when, all of it sourced, all of it verified, and every claim supported by documentation or named witnesses or both. By the following Monday, Bellamy Freight had been formally suspended from the federal contractor list pending the board's review. The independent board issued its finding 11 days later and disqualified indefinitely. The findings cited the safety violations, the missing maintenance records, and the documented pattern of witness interference and evidence suppression during an active federal review. And it was 7 pages long, and Darnell's name appeared in it exactly once, in a footnote acknowledging his recusal and the clean transfer of documentation. That was how it should be. Conrad's board of directors met the following Thursday, and he tendered his resignation before the vote was called. His name came off the letterhead before the end of the month, and the contract he'd spent the entire summer trying to protect was gone, and the professional relationships he'd spent 20 years building to protect things like it were going to take considerably longer to rebuild, if they rebuilt at all. And Ethan accepted a plea agreement the week after. Assault with a dangerous weapon, probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory anger management, which was the condition in the agreement that felt most real to Darnell when Sheila read him the terms, and not the charge, not the probation. The room Ethan was going to have to sit in and reckon with the thing his father had been building in him since he was old enough to lose a fight. His gym owner called the full training staff together the same week the plea was entered, and he played the unedited footage in front of every student in the building. Then he said, in a room that stayed very quiet while he spoke, that a trained fighter who used those skills to threaten a woman had already failed the only evaluation that actually mattered in that gym, and he stripped the black belt in front of everyone. Ethan walked out. The phones stayed in pockets. Nobody met his eyes as he went. The sponsorship company withdrew its offer within the week. No public statement. And they simply removed his name from every platform connected to the brand. The way you quietly remove something that has become a liability before anyone has to say that word out loud. The CPS file was closed without further action, and Beverly Holt called personally to let Darnell know. And she said she rarely saw cases close this cleanly. She said she hoped the family's fall was considerably quieter than the summer had been. Darnell thanked her, set the phone down, stood in his kitchen for a few minutes without doing anything in particular, and he thought about Carl Owens. He called his contact at the department the next morning and asked for a status on civil claim. His contact told him the claim had been reopened. A legal team connected through the ethics board process had taken it on, and the brake maintenance records reconstructed from fleet logs the Bellamy legal team had failed to fully erase were now part of the civil record. 14 months, but moving, That was something. The moving truck came on the last Saturday of September, and same company as the one that had arrived at the beginning of June. Same green and white logo on the side, different direction, backing out instead of pulling in. Darnell watched from the porch. He saw Ethan come out of the house once, carrying a box, and Ethan saw him on the porch. He set the box down. He walked across the lawn. He looked different. Not repaired, nothing like that. But smaller in the way people get when the performance falls away, and what's underneath hasn't been strengthened yet to fill the space left behind. And he looked like someone standing in a version of himself that didn't fit anymore, without quite knowing yet what sasses he actually wore. He stopped at the property line. "Why didn't you break my arm?" And he said, no setup, no preamble. Just the question, the way real questions arrive when someone has been sitting with them long enough. Darnell looked at him. "Because I'd already won by then," he said. Ethan stayed with that, and he looked over at the side of the yard where Zoe was crouched near the fence, a small trowel in her hand and dirt on her knees, not looking at either of them. "She kept records," he said, "on me, and for weeks. Yes, she's the one who called the reporter." Yes, Ethan looked at the fence line, at the vine running along the base of it, newly replanted, still finding its direction. "I didn't know about the driver," he said. "I knew there was a file. And I knew my father was worried about something. I didn't ask what it was. He kept his eyes on the fence. I don't know if that's better or worse. And it's neither," Darnell said. "It's just where you start from." Ethan looked up. He nodded once. He went back to the truck. Darnell watched him go. Then he came down the porch steps and crossed the lawn and crouched down beside Zoe in the dirt. And she handed him a stem without being asked. And he pressed it against the fence and worked the soil. In around the base, the way Claire had shown him years ago, when she'd planted this vine the first time on a Saturday afternoon with dirt on her knees and absolutely no idea what she was doing. And they worked for a while without talking. "She killed everything the first year," Zoe said. "Your mother? With this vine, she told me. She made every mistake, then figured it out." Zoe pressed her palm flat against the soil. She thought that was the best way to learn, and not around the mistakes. Through them. He looked at her. She was looking at the fence, at the new growth beginning to work its way up the old wood. "And she didn't want you to be different," Zoe said. "She just wanted you to let me in." He sat with the stem in his hands for a moment. He didn't have anything to say to that. He didn't need to. She was right. She had been right. Claire had been right. And he had spent 3 years in the vicinity of that truth without walking through the door it was holding open. He walked through it now. Late but through it. And then maybe through it was enough. Maybe it had to be. He planted the stem. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. You okay?" He looked at the vine, at the fence, at the house next door where the windows were dark and the driveway was empty for the first time since June, and the daughter's hands in the dirt beside his. "Getting there," he said. She nodded. She handed him another stem. The light went flat as the afternoon turned, and the air carried the smell of turned earth and the first real hint of the season coming. Porch lights were starting to come on down the street. The sound of someone's screen door 2 houses over, and Cedar Lane settling into the particular quiet of a neighborhood at the end of something. Zoe sat back on her heels and looked at what they'd done. The vine wasn't all the way back. Some sections still sparse, still finding their direction, but the roots had held through everything. And all summer, through the heat and the damage, and the weeks when nobody had tended to it, more alive in the ground than it had looked when they'd first pulled the broken parts away. "Next summer," she said. "Next summer," he said, but she looked at him sideways. "And you going to be different next summer?" He thought about it the honest way before he answered. "I'm going to try," he said. She nodded. "That's enough," she said, and meant it. And 2 hands in the same patch of ground, the last light of the day on Cedar Lane, and the vine growing slowly back toward where it had been, and past it, and beyond what it had been before, and the way things go when they finally get the room to, and quietly, the way most real things do.